The stars had always been a mystery to humanity. For thousands of years, people had looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. Other worlds, other lives, other civilizations. When at last humanity discovered that they were not alone, it changed everything. Countless species lived across the galaxy, some older than humans could imagine, some far more advanced. But strangely, not all of them seemed as curious or as brave as the humans had once thought. It started with whispers. Strange signals reached the far corners of known space, carrying warnings. Something was moving between the stars, and it was not like anything seen before. Entire sectors went dark without explanation. Outposts, colonies, even old empires suddenly fell silent. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The more powerful races ignored it, the weaker ones hid, and many simply pretended nothing was happening. But the silence grew louder with each passing day, and the evidence could no longer be denied. Something dangerous was coming, something that terrified even the strongest. When humanity learned of this threat, they felt a strange mix of fear and determination. On Earth and its colonies, people gathered around screens and listened to reports about the vanished systems. Some leaders argued for caution, saying that humans were still too new to the galactic stage to involve themselves. Others argued that waiting meant death. Humanity had always been small compared to the great powers, but they had never been the kind to simply sit still while danger closed in. The silence of the stars frightened many. Other civilizations locked their borders, shut down trade, and cut off contact. One by one, they withdrew into themselves, as if isolation could keep the danger away. For humanity, this silence was even worse than the threat itself. To them, it felt like abandonment. The galaxy was full of great powers, full of species who had survived for millennia, yet in the face of one enemy, they chose to hide. What struck humans the most was how quickly these mighty civilizations accepted fear. The same races who once spoke proudly of their power and history now refused to lift a finger. For humans, this was hard to understand. Their own history was filled with struggle, wars, disasters, and challenges that forced them to stand together. Survival had never been easy, but it had taught them to fight, adapt, and rebuild. To see entire empires choose silence instead of action was something humans could not ignore. On the space stations orbiting human colonies, conversations grew restless. Workers, soldiers, scientists all asked the same question. If no one else will act, should we? It was a dangerous thought. Humanity knew they were still young compared to others. Their ships were smaller, their fleets fewer, their weapons less advanced. On paper, they had no chance. But history had shown them something different. Strength was not only measured in numbers or technology. Strength came from willpower, from refusing to back down when it mattered most. Some human leaders tried to calm their people, saying, "We must wait, we must see." But the ordinary people disagreed. For them, waiting had never been the human way. When a storm came, they faced it. When disaster struck, they rebuilt. When enemies threatened, they resisted. Fear was real, but it had never been enough to chain their spirit. In those days, the silence of the stars became heavier. Messages once filled with trade requests and diplomatic talks turned into cold, empty static. Even allies of humanity began withdrawing, leaving humans to fend for themselves. Yet this isolation sparked something unexpected: unity. For the first time in history, humanity, scattered across Earth, Mars, the moons, and distant colonies, spoke with one voice. They realized that if no one else would stand, they would have to. There were long nights in command centers where officers studied maps of the galaxy, tracing the dark spaces where entire civilizations had gone missing. In classrooms, teachers spoke quietly to children about bravery and hope, reminding them that even small acts could matter. In workshops, engineers worked late into the night, modifying old ships, designing new defenses, preparing for a fight they were not sure they could win. It wasn't just the soldiers who felt the weight of the coming storm. It was everyone. The silence outside their windows was not just a warning. It was a call. A call to prove that humanity could be more than survivors, more than explorers. It was a chance to show that even without being the strongest, they could still be the bravest. The other civilizations expected humans to do what they had done: hide, wait, and hope the storm would pass them by. But deep inside, humans were different. They had a history of standing when others would not. From ancient times on Earth to the early struggles in space, they had faced overwhelming odds before. This time was no different, only larger, scarier, and beyond anything they had known. Yet their response remained the same. They would not run. The silence of the stars was frightening because it showed what fear could do. It could paralyze entire worlds, make proud empires hide, and silence voices that once filled the galaxy with confidence. But humanity looked at that silence and decided it would not claim them too. They would speak, they would act, and they would fight if necessary. And so, in that great quiet, when no one else answered, humanity began to prepare. Ships were armed, defenses built, alliances, however fragile, were sought again. Not everyone believed they could succeed, but for humans, success was not the point. The point was that someone had to try, because if no one did, there would be nothing left. The silence of the stars had revealed a truth to humanity. It wasn't strength or age that defined greatness, but the courage to rise when no one else would. And in that dark moment, humanity chose to step forward. They did not know what awaited them beyond the silence. They did not know how strong the enemy truly was. But they knew one thing. They would not stand by and watch the universe fall. If the silence was the choice of others, then action would be the choice of humanity. That decision, quiet, fragile, yet unshakable, was the beginning of everything. It was the first step that would change not just the fate of humanity, but the fate of the entire galaxy. The decision to step forward had been made, but making a choice and living with it were two very different things. Humanity had declared that it would not hide, that it would not allow the silence of the stars to spread without resistance. But, once the weight of that declaration settled, people began to realize what it truly meant. To fight when others had already given up was not only dangerous, it was terrifying. And so humanity became something it had never planned to be: reluctant, guardians of a galaxy that did not even want them to act. The leaders of human colonies gathered in long councils. Some argued for a careful approach, for waiting until the danger revealed itself fully. Others believed delay would only give the enemy more strength. But even among those willing to act, there was doubt. Could humans truly carry the weight of a universe that had abandoned its courage? Were they strong enough to hold the line when much older civilizations had chosen to retreat? The debates went on for weeks, and though voices grew loud, the fear beneath the arguments was always the same: we are not ready. Ordinary people felt that fear too. Workers in factories whispered about whether their ships would survive a first strike. Families on Earth and Mars worried about what war among the stars would mean for their children. Even the soldiers, brave as they were, carried heavy hearts. They were trained for defense, for exploration, for survival. But to take on the role of guardians, that was something else entirely. Despite the doubts, preparations continued. Fleets were assembled, weapons tested, and strategies drawn up. Yet, in every meeting and every command room, hesitation lingered. Humans were stepping into the role of protectors, but reluctantly. They had not been asked to take this burden. They had chosen it themselves, and that choice carried both pride and dread. Other civilizations looked at humanity with confusion. To them, the human response made no sense. Why risk everything when survival could still be achieved by hiding? Why fight for a galaxy that had turned its back? Some called the humans reckless, others naive. But even as they mocked, they secretly watched. Because deep down, a part of them wondered if the humans might succeed where they had failed. The reluctance of humanity was not weakness. In truth, it was what made their decision meaningful. They did not leap into danger out of arrogance. They did not believe themselves stronger than the ancient empires. They did not fight because they wanted glory. They fought because they felt they had no other choice. If no one else would stand, then someone had to. Even if their hands trembled, they still picked up the shield. In training fields across the colonies, young recruits pushed themselves harder than ever. Many admitted openly that they were afraid, but they trained anyway. In laboratories, scientists worked on designs that might give their fleets an edge, even if the improvements were small. On the farms and in the cities, civilians prepared supplies, knowing that if war came, everyone would play a part. Reluctance did not stop them from moving forward. If anything, it made them work harder, because they understood the weight of what they were doing. The galaxy did not thank them. In fact, some alien leaders grew angry. Humans are foolish, they said. By resisting, they will only draw the enemy's attention. Warnings and threats were sent, urging humanity to stop before it was too late. But humans had already lived through too many moments in history where silence had cost lives. They knew that refusing to act would not make the danger disappear. It would only give it more power. So they continued, quietly, steadily, with reluctant determination. Each day, more ships were fitted for long journeys, more stations were reinforced, more colonies readied themselves for the unknown. Fear never left them, but they learned to live with it. What surprised the galaxy most was how humans spoke about their decision. When questioned by alien envoys, human representatives never claimed to be saviors or heroes. Instead, they said simple words. We cannot stand by. We have to try. Those words carried a kind of honesty that others had forgotten. It was not pride or arrogance, it was duty. And slowly, that honesty began to spread. Among the frightened species who had hidden away, whispers started to grow. If the youngest of them all, humanity, could at least make an attempt, what excuse did they have for hiding? Some small groups began to reach out, offering quiet help, sending supplies, or sharing knowledge. It wasn't much, but it was something. Humanity's reluctant guardianship was awakening sparks of courage elsewhere. Still, the humans never pretended to feel no fear. In their homes, in their councils, in their quiet prayers, they admitted openly that they did not know if they would win. The future was uncertain, the enemy still unseen, and the cost unknown. But in that uncertainty, they found a strange kind of strength, because if the future was unwritten, then perhaps it could still be shaped by their hands. The reluctant guardianship of humanity was not about confidence. It was about responsibility. When the universe fell silent, humans heard the silence not as an excuse to retreat, but as a call for someone to answer. They answered reluctantly because they knew the risks. But they answered all the same, because deep down, humanity had never been the kind to leave the fire burning while pretending the smoke did not exist. The people of Earth, Mars, and beyond did not march forward with cheers and songs. They marched with heavy steps, with quiet voices, and with determination forged by fear. Yet those heavy steps carried more meaning than any loud declaration ever could. Because when all others had turned away, humanity stepped forward, not proudly, but bravely. And though they did not know it yet, their reluctant choice would one day echo louder than the silence that had once filled the stars. The first step is always the hardest. For months, humanity had prepared itself, carrying the weight of being the only ones willing to stand. Ships had been built, fleets gathered, soldiers trained, and supplies stored. But no amount of preparation could take away the fear of moving forward into the unknown. Everyone knew that the moment they left their safe harbors, the real test would begin. It would no longer be talk or plans or practice. It would be action, and action always came with risk. The first mission was not a full war, but a probe of courage, a decision to leave safety and place themselves directly in harm's way. A signal had been detected on the edge of a forgotten system. It was faint, but its pattern suggested something unnatural, something not born from nature but from design. Some feared it was already the enemy creeping closer. Others thought it might be the ruins of a fallen civilization, perhaps a warning, or a clue to what had happened to those who had vanished. Whatever it was, it demanded an answer. The humans debated long into the night. Many voices urged caution, asking if rushing into the dark would only bring destruction. Others said that waiting was more dangerous, that sitting still was exactly what had doomed the older species. In the end, they agreed. Someone had to go. Not a vast fleet, not a reckless charge, just one step, a cautious but deliberate step into the fire. When the chosen ships departed, they did so quietly. There were no celebrations, no crowds cheering. Families watched in silence, some holding hands, others whispering prayers. The soldiers aboard those ships felt the weight of history pressing down on their shoulders. They were not only representing their own people, but the spirit of humanity itself. The galaxy had doubted them, laughed at them, even scolded them for daring to act. Now, those same doubters were watching to see if humans would break before the first trial. The journey itself was not long, but every moment stretched. Crews spoke little, their minds heavy with questions. What would they find? Would the enemy already be waiting? Would they even return? Even the bravest hearts admitted, quietly, that they were afraid. Yet fear did not stop them from moving forward. Fear walked beside them, but it did not lead. When the ships arrived at the signal's source, they found the ruins of a once thriving outpost. The structures floated silent in space, broken and scarred by something violent. No bodies remained, only fragments of machines and shattered walls. It was a ghost, a reminder of what could happen to anyone who turned away from the fight. The crew moved carefully, gathering information, piecing together the story of what had happened. The evidence was clear. This colony had not fallen to nature or accident. It had been destroyed by force, by a power sharp and merciless, and it had not been recent. The destruction was years old, perhaps even decades. Yet the silence of the ruins spoke loudly. This was what hiding and hoping for safety had brought. This was the fire that consumed without warning. For a moment, despair washed over the crew. Was this what awaited humanity too? Were they only walking toward the same end? But then another thought rose, stronger than despair. These ruins were proof that the enemy was not invincible. Time had passed since this attack. Whoever had done this was not a god, not a force beyond reason. They could be fought. They could be delayed. Perhaps they could even be defeated. The humans recorded everything. They sent transmissions back to their leaders, describing what they had seen, showing the scars of the outpost, and warning that this was the reality of the threat. And when the message spread across human colonies, something changed. The fear was still there, but alongside it grew a harder determination. Now the danger was no longer just words or rumors. Now it was real, and humanity knew what was at stake. The first step into the fire had burned, but it had also lit a spark. The crew did not stop with only recording the ruins. They searched deeper, following faint traces of energy. What they found was unexpected, a hidden cache of records buried beneath the wreckage. Somehow, some of the data cores had survived the destruction. With careful work, the scientists pulled fragments of information from them. Maps, signals, records of warnings sent long ago by the colony before it fell. The warnings had never been answered, perhaps ignored, perhaps silenced by fear. But now, they had reached human hands. In those files was knowledge of the enemy. Not complete, not enough to solve the mystery, but pieces, patterns of movement, hints of their strategies, the way they struck and then vanished. Humanity now had more than fear. They had direction. They had proof. They had a starting point for resistance. Returning with this knowledge was not a victory in the traditional sense. No battles had been won, no enemies defeated. But in another way, it was greater than any victory. Humanity had taken its first step into the fire and survived. They had faced the ruins of others, gathered their courage, and returned stronger than before. And in that moment, they proved something to themselves. They were not helpless. When the news spread, even those who had doubted began to feel pride. Yes, the danger was terrifying. Yes, the enemy was powerful, but humans had not turned back. They had gone where others refused to go, and they had brought back light from the darkness. That light was not just knowledge, but the reminder that hope could be built, even in ashes. The galaxy was watching. The silent species, the ones who had hidden in their strongholds, heard the reports of what humanity had done. Some shook their heads, calling it foolishness. Others stayed quiet, uncertain. But a few began to wonder. Perhaps these humans were different. Perhaps they carried something that others had lost long ago. The reluctant guardians had now become the first explorers of resistance. They had shown that stepping into danger did not always end in death. Sometimes it ended in discovery, in courage, in sparks that grew into fire. And though the path ahead remained dark, they now knew they had the strength to take another step. Humanity's journey into the fire was only beginning, but the first step was the most important of all. It proved that even when afraid, even when uncertain, humans would move forward. They would not stand still. They would not let silence swallow them as it had swallowed others. And deep in their hearts, every human understood something simple yet powerful. The first step into the fire was not just survival, it was the beginning of a story that could change everything. The path forward was never meant to be easy. Humanity had already taken its first steps into the fire, and though they had returned with knowledge, it came at a cost. Every message sent back from the crews, every scan of ruined outposts, every warning drawn from fragments of destroyed colonies carried a silent truth. This fight would demand more than courage. It would demand sacrifice. The leaders of Earth and its scattered colonies understood it first. Supplies were running low, ships were stretched thin, and the threat was moving faster than their preparations. If they waited too long, they would be swallowed just as the silent civilizations had been. If they moved too quickly, they risked burning out before they even had a chance. Either way, lives would be lost. That reality settled heavily on every heart. The soldiers preparing for missions knew it too. Training could not erase the knowledge that many of them would never see home again. They kept their faces calm, some even smiling, but their eyes betrayed the weight they carried. For every person stepping onto a ship, there was someone left behind. A mother whispering a prayer, a child asking when they would return, a friend forcing themselves to believe in promises of survival. Those promises were often lies told with love. When the first true confrontation arrived, it came without warning. A human patrol fleet stumbled upon something unexpected. Enemy scouts, fast and silent, slipping through a forgotten corridor of space. It was not a grand battle, not yet, but it was enough to test the steel of human resolve. The patrol had two choices: retreat and warn the colonies, or engage and delay the scouts long enough for reinforcements to prepare. They chose the harder path. The fight was brief but brutal. Human ships were not yet as advanced as their enemies. The scouts struck with precision, cutting through metal and fire. Yet the humans refused to break. They fought not to win, but to buy time, every second earned with blood and steel. Some ships threw themselves in front of enemy fire, shielding the rest. Others overloaded their engines, ramming straight into enemy craft to take them down. By the time reinforcements arrived, half the patrol fleet was gone. When the survivors returned, battered and scarred, the people celebrated them as heroes. But the survivors themselves did not feel like heroes. They carried the faces of those who had not returned, the ones who had laughed with them only days before, the ones who had sworn they would make it home. The weight of their loss was heavy, pressing down on every celebration. Victory, they realized, would never come without a cost. The leaders tried to comfort the grieving families. Words of honor and sacrifice were spoken. Monuments were planned. But the truth was plain. No words could fill the emptiness left behind. The cost of every battle was measured not in ships or machines, but in lives. Lives that could never be replaced. And yet, something deeper grew from that grief. Instead of weakening, humanity grew stronger. The pain became fuel, the loss became resolve. People who had once doubted now stepped forward, volunteering for roles they had once feared. Engineers worked day and night, determined to give soldiers better weapons, stronger shields, faster ships. Farmers grew more than they could afford to, donating food to the war effort. Even children began writing letters to the front lines, small, words of hope sent across the stars. Everyone carried the weight of sacrifice, not just the soldiers, and it was that shared burden that began to unite humanity in a way it had never been before. The galaxy noticed. Silent eyes from distant civilizations watched as humans mourned their dead, yet continued to fight. Some whispered that humanity was reckless, throwing lives away. Others saw something else, something dangerous, something powerful. A people who refused to stop even when the cost grew unbearable. The next missions became harder. Each step forward into enemy territory demanded more risks, more lives. Some missions were called suicide runs, where soldiers knew before leaving that they would not return. Yet volunteers filled those ships, not out of blind courage, but out of love for the ones behind them. They knew that by carrying the weight themselves, they could spare others. One such mission became legendary. A group of pilots were tasked with luring an enemy fleet away from a vulnerable colony. The enemy's strength was overwhelming, and the pilots knew there was no chance of survival. But they went anyway. For hours, they danced in the void, pulling the enemy across light years of space, giving just enough resistance to keep them chasing. Never enough to be destroyed too quickly. And when their fuel finally ran out, they turned their ships toward the enemy and lit the stars with their final blaze. That colony survived because of them. And though their names were whispered, with tears their story spread like fire. They became symbols of what humanity was willing to give, and more importantly, why. The weight of sacrifice was not only measured in death, but also in choices. Leaders were forced to decide which colonies to save and which to abandon. Not everyone could be protected. Sometimes resources had to be pulled away from one group to save another. Those decisions tore hearts apart, but they had to be made. And when they were, the people accepted them, not because they agreed, but because they trusted that every life spared was worth the pain of loss. The war was shaping humanity into something new. They were no longer just survivors, no longer just explorers. They were guardians, carrying the burden of not only their own survival, but the chance of hope for every silent species watching from the shadows. The sacrifices made by humans sent ripples through the galaxy, ripples that stirred ancient powers and sleeping civilizations. Some began to reconsider their silence. If humans could bleed and fight and suffer so much for the future, perhaps they too could rise again. In quiet moments, soldiers wrote letters they knew might never be delivered. Parents told their children stories about courage, reminding them that even the smallest light could shine in the darkest night. Pilots touched the controls of their ships with reverence, knowing each mission might be their last. And yet, in all of this, there was no despair strong enough to break them. The weight of sacrifice was heavy, but it was not crushing. Instead, it was shaping humanity into something unyielding. Every loss carved into their spirit, every tear forged their will sharper. They learned that sacrifice was not the end of hope. It was the proof of hope. It was the evidence that what they were fighting for mattered enough to give everything. And so, step by step, humanity walked forward, not because they were fearless, but because they carried the memory of those who had fallen. Each name etched into their hearts became a reason to keep moving. The galaxy had underestimated them, believing that fear and loss would break them. Instead, it was teaching them how to endure, how to stand, and how to rise stronger with every blow. The stars grew darker, the enemy closer, but humanity pressed on. The fire burned hotter, and the weight of sacrifice grew heavier. Yet in that weight, humanity found its greatest strength. The knowledge that they were not fighting for themselves alone. They were fighting for every voice that had been silenced, for every world that had fallen, and for every life that still clung to hope. And with each sacrifice, the message became louder, clearer, impossible to ignore. Humanity would not stop, not until the stars themselves had nothing left to burn. The war was not over, but something had already changed. The galaxy that had once been silent, the stars that had once watched without speaking, were now alive with whispers. Stories of humanity had spread from one system to another, carried, not only by signals and reports, but by the memories of those who had seen them fight. Even in the darkest corners, where civilizations had once hidden in fear, there was now a faint light of courage. And at the center of it all, humans stood, bloodied, tired, but unbroken. The lesson carved in stars did not come in a single moment. It was built through every sacrifice, every tear, every choice that had seemed impossible. Humans had shown the universe something it had forgotten, that weakness could become strength, that loss could create unity, and that even when hope seemed lost, it could be reborn if someone was willing to carry it forward. For the first time in centuries, ancient races who had hidden from conflict began to stir. Some sent quiet signals of support, others shared old knowledge long locked away, and a few even offered to stand beside humanity. But they did not move because of power or weapons. They moved because they saw something different, something no other species had dared to give. Humanity had proven that they would fight not just for themselves, but for a future where all voices could still exist. In the great halls of command, where leaders gathered, discussions became less about survival and more about purpose. No longer was the question only how to fight, but why to fight. The answer was clear. They were not simply battling an enemy. They were protecting the chance for life itself to go on. They were carrying the memory of those already gone and making sure their sacrifices were not wasted. That understanding reshaped everything. Among the people, this truth became deeply personal. Farmers looked at the food they grew and knew it was more than harvest. It was fuel for courage. Engineers tightened bolts and checked circuits with the thought that someone's survival depended on their care. Even the youngest children, too small to understand war, learned to say words of encouragement, knowing their voices mattered. Everyone had a part in carrying the weight, and that shared effort created a strength that no single soldier could provide. And yet, the greatest lesson was not in what humanity gave up, but in what they refused to lose. They refused to lose their compassion, even for strangers. They refused to lose their laughter, even in dark times. They refused to lose their hope, even when the odds were against them. That refusal echoed across the stars like a silent song that others could not ignore. When another great battle came, it was no longer only humans who stood against the tide. Ships of other civilizations, hesitant but determined, appeared beside them. Their weapons were older, their crews untested, but they had found the courage to rise again. And in the heat of battle, humanity did not lead with pride. They led with example. They fought shoulder to shoulder, showing their allies that unity was stronger than fear. It was in that unity that the galaxy began to change. The enemy, once unstoppable, now faced something it had never expected, a combined will that refused to break. The battles were still brutal, and victory was never easy, but the tide had shifted. Each fight carried not only the weight of sacrifice, but also the strength of countless voices refusing to vanish. Humanity had shown the way, and now others followed. But even in victory, humans did not see themselves as conquerors. They saw themselves as caretakers of a lesson written in blood and starlight. They had learned that survival was never just about strength. It was about standing for something greater, something that stretched beyond themselves. And that lesson would remain even after the war was done. Long after the battles ended, when the skies were quiet again, that lesson was remembered. Children grew up hearing the stories of those who had given everything so others could live. Monuments were built, not to glorify war, but to honor courage and unity. Each stone, each name, each light that shone in remembrance reminded them of what it had cost to carve that lesson into the stars. Travelers crossing the galaxy found signs of humanity's impact everywhere. Once silent worlds had begun to rebuild. Old ruins were lit again with hope. And in every corner there was a saying passed quietly from one being to another. We stand because they stood first. The stars themselves became symbols. Where once they had seemed cold and distant, now they glowed with meaning. For every soul lost, a light was remembered. For every sacrifice, a star was honored. And when people looked up at the night sky, they did not see emptiness. They saw a story written across the heavens, a story of resilience and courage that no darkness could erase. Even among humans, this lesson reshaped their future. They no longer saw themselves as small, fragile beings in an endless universe. They saw themselves as part of something greater, as voices strong enough to inspire even the oldest and most powerful civilizations. The war had cost them dearly, but it had also given them an identity that no one could take away. Years later, when peace had settled and the enemy was only a memory, there were still moments when fear threatened to return. But each time, people remembered the lesson carved in stars. They remembered that no darkness was absolute, no silence eternal, and no weakness permanent. As long as even one voice chose to stand, hope could survive. This became humanity's true gift to the universe. Not their ships, not their weapons, not their strategies. Their gift was a reminder that life mattered, that sacrifice could create meaning, and that unity could turn even the smallest spark into a blazing fire. And so, the galaxy carried on, shaped forever by the time when only humanity had stepped forward. Their story was told in halls and homes, on ships and on distant planets. Each telling reminded listeners of the cost, but also of the truth, that sometimes the weakest-seeming voices carried the strongest songs. In the end, humanity's lesson was not written on paper or stone. It was carved into the stars themselves, shining for all to see. And whenever someone looked up, wondering if hope was worth the struggle, the stars answered with a silent truth. Yes, it is worth everything, because once, when the universe needed saviors, humanity stepped forward. And in doing so, they gave the galaxy a gift it would never forget, the lesson that courage, compassion, and unity could outshine even the deepest darkness.